You see, only the guilty fear judgment. See? Those who have lived a decent life, a good life, they're not afraid of judgment. They're not afraid of that at all. It's those who have lived wrong, those who are guilty, those are the people who recoil from judgment. And that was the secret of Solzhenitsyn. That's why in the West, he was not received with open arms. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a great man. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a man, he was like Moses, quite frankly. He is a man I respect more and more each year that passes in my own life. Because you see, when you're young, you admire certain people. You admire certain people because you're told to admire them. And they're cool, you know, like rock stars and shit like that, movie actors. You know, you're taught to admire, you know, Johnny Depp because he's cool or some crap like that. But as you get older, you start to realize that people like that are kind of pathetic. And they're morally paltry, you know, insubstantial, insignificant. And somebody like Solzhenitsyn, you look at Solzhenitsyn and he's like this balding, bearded old guy, right? He's dead now. And you say, you know, he's like some writer from like the Soviet Union, you know, he was like a prisoner in some camp, and you're like, oh God, he seems boring. And when you're young, of course, you do find him boring. As you get older, as you get a little bit of experience under your belt, you start to realize what a man he was, like a real man, you know? And you have, what, testicles like about that size, you know, the size of a plump grape? You know, Solzhenitsyn walked around with a couple of bowling balls between his legs. I mean, that's how big his balls were. Because he truly spoke truth to power when it counted, when it mattered. Okay? I mean, I'm not doing this video very well, but let me get into it in a little more detail. You see, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was born in 1918. And starting as a young man, he wanted to be a writer. He wanted to be a writer, and he wanted to be a Russian writer. And Russia, of course, has this incredible literary tradition. You know, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, you know, Chekhov. I mean, you can go on and on and on, you know. If all of the world's literature, except Russian literature, were to suddenly vanish, Russian literature would be enough for all of us. It is, you know, one of the gems of Western civilization. And Solzhenitsyn, you know, like any ambitious young artist, he wanted to join that tradition. Perfectly fine. And he was a young man. He studied, I believe, mathematics. And then the Second World War started, and he joined artillery, I think. And he was a decorated man. He served on the front. And he was twice decorated for bravery. He was a brave soldier. He was a good soldier, a good man. I think he was, I could be wrong, but I think he was a captain or got to the rank of captain. It doesn't matter. He was in the army. And what happened to him was that near the end of the war, he wrote in a private letter to a friend of his, he wrote some very mild criticism of Stalin. Because already in the Second World War, he was seeing things that he didn't approve of insofar as Soviet society. Until then, he'd been a true believer. He'd been completely convinced that the Soviet Union and its system was the best and all the rest of it. But his experiences in the war and seeing fighting in Prussia, and it had made him change his mind. And he had written some very slight criticism in a private letter, and for that he was given 8 years in the Gulag, in the concentration camp system of the Soviet Union, right? He was there 8 years. He eventually came out in 53, 54, and he was in internal exile, which is basically being sent to some random spot in Siberia and not being able to leave from that place and having a job there. But, you know, it was basically being a prisoner even though you're out of doors. Sort of like being on probation, but not living in your own city, but living in some city far away. That was internal exile. And he had to go and register with the secret police and, you know, anyway, the point is he was in internal exile until 1956. And after that, you know, I think he went back to Moscow, as I recall, and he worked as a teacher. I know that he worked as a teacher. I forget the details exactly. And he was working on his literary aspirations, but, you know, not getting much of anywhere until 1962, where he was able to give a copy of a manuscript that he had written that was eventually called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Now, by this time, Solzhenitsyn was a man of 44, and he was, a former Zek. Zek is the name of a prisoner in a concentration camp of the Gulag, right? He was a former Zek, in very straitened circumstances, and just getting nowhere in life and putting all of his energy into his literary aspirations. And of course, trying to get published, but in order to get published in the Soviet Union, you had to have official approval. It was communism, okay? And there were censors, and you had to get past the censors. Anyway, he was able to hand the manuscript of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich to the editor of Novy Mir, which was a famous literary magazine at the time. And it just so happened that this was the beginning of the Khrushchev thaw, where Khrushchev, having taken power after Stalin died, was trying to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union because there had been just too much terror, too much repression during the Stalin time. And Khrushchev instituted this thaw. And it was into this thaw that this novel landed in the lap of the editor of Novy Mir. And they published it. Now, it became an instant sensation. Why did it become an instant sensation? Well, on the one hand, Solzhenitsyn was, throughout his life, an incredibly energetic writer. I mean, he writes at a galloping pace. I mean, really, he writes almost like a pulp novelist, okay? Even in his most serious and just shattering works, you have this sense of life rushing through his prose. The One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is no exception. The other issue was the theme of the novel. Now, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich it's a shattering novel because, you see, it's one day in the life of this prisoner in a gulag, right? Now, here's the thing. It is a good day in a good prison camp. And the conditions are horrifying, There's barely enough to eat. There are little, politicking in power plays over a blanket. Not kidding. The blanket becomes like a big thing in the novel, right? There's all this thing, the shoes, they didn't have shoes. They had to put rags on their feet because of the cold. And at the end of the day, Ivan Denisovich is happy. It was a good day in a good prison camp, and it is horrifying. It is shattering. All right? And in a weird way, it's comic. It's comic in a bizarre way that you can't quite fathom. You can't quite believe that this guy, this young author, or not so young author at this time, that this man is pulling off in this novel. It's a remarkable achievement, and there's no question that it was a publishable book. And it was published, but it was only published because of the political circumstances of the time. Because never forget, in the Soviet Union, if you were politically incorrect, you just didn't get published, you didn't get heard. That is the example. The Soviet Union is an example of political correctness taken to extremes, taken to its ultimate extreme. Only approved speech, anything that is, quote, hate speech, never even mentioned, never even discussed. And it was only at that time that people were allowed to talk about a concentration camp system that conservative estimates calculate took in 10% of the Russian population. Every 10th person in the Soviet Union at one time or another was in the Gulag system. It was a concentration camp system that dwarfs the Nazi concentration camp system. It was forced labor camps. That's what it was. Slave labor. That's what it was. And it was a necessary component of the Soviet Union. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn would write about it his entire life. So, he wrote Ivan Denisovich, and it became a literary sensation because apart from discussing this very repressive situation, the reality, the truth of the gulags, it was an incredibly energetic novel. He became an approved writer. He became protected by Khrushchev. But Solzhenitsyn was a wise man. He realized even then, even in the middle of the thaw, that this wouldn't last. So he pursued two strategies. On the one hand, he announced that he was working on new novels, one called The First Circle and another called August 1914. And yet at the same time, starting, I believe, in 58 or 59, he started writing what became the Gulag Archipelago. Now, let me talk to you about Solzhenitsyn's literary career. There were two phases of it, the non-fiction and the fiction. Now, all of his fiction was historically based. All of it was centered in Russia. Unlike Western writers who were very, wrote about the interior, following Flaubert's Madame Bovary, and Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, quite frankly, Solzhenitsyn wasn't so interested in the individual psychology. He was more interested in the sweep of history. He was very Tolstoyan in that regard. And this would play against him, because as a novelist, as a fiction writer, the weight of Tolstoy would always hang heavy on him, because he always saw Tolstoy as the man to beat, as it were. He, in a very real sense, insofar as his fiction career is concerned, he always saw, he fell for the anxiety of influence trap that Harold Bloom discussed. The notion that Tolstoy was the writer to beat and he had to be better than Tolstoy. Okay, and so he was always comparing himself to Tolstoy, and his books subconsciously tried to be Tolstoyan. But then again, the kind of material that Solzhenitsyn wanted to write, he wanted to write about the broad canvas of history, and so it was inevitable that his novels would be big and sprawling. Okay, I mean, The First Circle is his shortest novel. The First Circle is about the a scientific prison. It's very similar structurally to The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And it is about a group of prisoners in this scientific prison, okay? Because the Soviet Union had different kinds of prisons. Some were just basic labor camps, and there were scientific prison camps. And here's something that you should know. Andrei Sakharov, who developed the Soviets' hydrogen bomb, well, he developed it in a prison camp. See, the hydrogen bomb, and in point of fact, all of the most of the the post-1950 Soviet atomic program was carried out by prisoners. They were enslaved to create the hydrogen bomb. Anyway, The First Circle is about such a prison. All right. And it's a very, very good novel, and it explains and shows you the kind of it shows both Soviet society in a microcosm in this prison, and at the same time it shows the psychology of the people and how each of them represents a different kind of psychology that was very typical in these labor camps. And it's a very interesting novel, but big and sprawling. All right. And that was the official novel that Solzhenitsyn was writing post the publication of Ivan Denisovich. I'm talking like in the mid-60s. He was secretly working on something much more powerful, and that was the Gulag Archipelago. Now, the Gulag Archipelago is, in my opinion, quite likely the most important book written in the 20th century. Now, I don't say this lightly, all right? I'm not saying, oh, it's the greatest book. No. I'm saying on the level. Okay, it's all good and fine to say that, Ulysses was a great novel. It's all good and fine to say The Magic Mountain or The Tin Drum or whatever. 100 Years of Solitude, that's up there as one of the great books of the 20th century. But they are all dwarfed by the achievement of the Gulag Archipelago. Now, what is the Gulag Archipelago? The Gulag Archipelago is the non-fiction side of Solzhenitsyn, all right, and it is his major achievement insofar as nonfiction is concerned. It is a book that eventually would be published in 3 volumes. It's actually broken up into 7 books. And it is a history of the concentration camp system, starting in 1918 and ending in 1956. Now, he took the testimony of, I believe it was 250 odd prisoners, zeks, like himself. First-hand accounts. This is primary source material that he had here. And he took down their accounts of their time in the prison system. All right? And he wrote this book. Now, why is this book so good? Why is it so important? Well, because, you see, before this book, there was the notion that The concentration camp system, the Gulag system of the Soviet Union, had been a product of Stalin and his insanity. And with this book, Solzhenitsyn achieved two things. Number one, he demonstrated that the origins of the concentration camp system had been imposed by Lenin at the very start of the Bolshevik regime in 1918. You know, it was Article 58, Section 10, I believe, was the famous one that created this, written by Lenin himself. All right? So the book showed that it wasn't Stalin, it was Lenin, and it wasn't just Lenin, it was communism that required a concentration camp system, because on an economic level, and this is what the novel proves, the Soviet Union could not have survived without the slave labor provided by the zeks, by the prisoners, by that 10% of the Soviet population. Think of it, 10%. Imagine, of any 10 people that you know, one of them spent at least a decade in a concentration camp. Think of that. Okay? Solzhenitsyn showed how the Soviet Union needed these slaves, that it could not exist without this slavery, because that's what it was. This was slave labor that was required for the Soviet economy to exist. Without it, the Soviet Union wouldn't have collapsed in 1991. It would have collapsed in 1950. All right? And this book proved it. It showed it. All right? This book showed that the communist system required it. The communist system had imposed it. And all the leaders of the Soviet Union had not just merely tacitly allowed it, they'd encouraged it, they'd created it. It was a monster. Structurally, the novel is very, very interesting because, you see, Solzhenitsyn weaves several strands in the novel. See, on the one hand is a legal history. Okay, now you think that there's nothing more dry than a legal history, but the way he writes it, and that's the genius of Solzhenitsyn as a novelist, as a writer. He was so energetic and passionate that he makes something as dry as a legal history seem fascinating. And he shows the development of the laws. With a novelist's eye, he's reporting all of these details. This is new journalism, okay, but in the Soviet Union. And of course, Solzhenitsyn didn't have access to Tom Wolfe and the new journalism that he was carrying out, okay. Solzhenitsyn independently invented new journalism. It was, okay, so anyway. So on the one hand, one strand was the development of the law. The second strand was the typical journey of a typical prisoner in one of these camps. Like one of the early chapters is called First Cell, First Love, because he explains how when you wind up in your first cell on your road, you know, and your journey of your decade of imprisonment, right? Because everybody got, 8 years, 10 years. That was the standard. Some got more, by the way. And some infraction along the way would require more. But often many people simply died in the camps, and so they never actually completed their term, and so they weren't, forced to another. But that's, think of the horror of it. But anyway, a second strand was showing the journey from arrest to the first processing, to being declared guilty, to his first cell, then sent to his first camp by cattle car, of course, like the Nazis, just like that, And, everything along the way until finally being released into internal exile and living in internal exile, which Solzhenitsyn felt was like a kind of death, right? Now, that was a second strand. The other strand was the political development of the Gulag system and how it grew, the bureaucracy of it. So he's weaving these various threads into one long and very firm strand that can't be broken. You can't just dismiss what he's telling you. You cannot honestly read that book and say, oh, it's just a personal opinion or speculation. No, no, no. And he goes on and on and on with the testimony of all these zeks in this book. And it is so much fun to read. That's the crazy part. He's talking about one of the most horrifying things in world history. Because this was one of the most horrifying things in world history. Tens of millions of people went through the Gulag in the Soviet Union. And he makes it riveting as a novelist, as a piece of literature. Even though, of course, it's nonfiction, even though every single thing in the book is completely and utterly accurate. And it's not that he says that, oh, I heard this. No. He says, this guy saw this happen with his own eyes, and this other guy saw it too. You know, it's like, it's true. Everything in the Gulag Archipelago is true, and it's a fun read. It's like, like Pulp Fiction about, the Holocaust. It's crazy, but it's an incredible book, an incredible achievement. And because of this book, when this book finally surfaced in the West in 1973, it broke the French Communist Party. They never recovered. All right, and in point of fact, communism in the West as a potentially viable political movement ceased once the Gulag Archipelago came out. Because you see, one of the powers that Solzhenitsyn has is that he is a moralist. He is a believer in good and he is a believer in evil. And he has no problem saying this is good and this is evil. And in the Gulag Archipelago, he says it. He points it out. He shows it. He rubs your face in it, right? He is not without mercy, okay? Because a lot of times you think that, oh, don't be judgmental, blah, blah, blah. But there is an element of judgment, but there's also an element of mercy. Solzhenitsyn was a Christian, an Orthodox Russian, right? And he was a Russian nationalist, but he was not an expansionist Russian. On the contrary, he was internal looking. Now, he's been, he started after Ivan Denisovich, as I was telling you. He officially said that he was working on the first circle and eventually had it published. And then working on August 1914, which is historical analysis of the First World War as a novel, right? But at the same time, he was working on the Gulag Archipelago. In secret, of course. I mean, he never had the whole manuscript in front of him. This is a huge book. It's about, I don't know, about 1,500 pages. I would guess about, 700,000 words, something like that. It's a huge book. Just to clue you in, like a standard novel is about, 80 to 100,000 words. And this is an easy 600, 700,000 words, I would guess. Okay, estimate, right? He never had the whole thing in front of him. He only worked on separate chapters because he was afraid that if he had the whole book in front of him, which he wrote by hand, right? He thought that if he had the entire manuscript in front of him, he might get arrested and he'd lose the whole thing. So he worked only on individual chapters. He had to keep the whole thing in his head, right? Which, by the way, he had practice of. You know how? Because when he had been a prisoner, they didn't give him any pen or paper. So what he had done is that he would write things. He was writing a poem while he was a prisoner, and he would memorize the lines. And he wrote in his head 1,000 lines of poetry, and he memorized the whole thing. And eventually he wrote it all out when he was released from prison camp. But another story. Getting back to the Gulag Archipelago, which is the main brunt of what I want to tell you here. See, Solzhenitsyn, the KGB, when the thaw happened and then Khrushchev fell in, the mid-60s, I believe? I forget when. But the point is, he fell, and then Brezhnev took over. And the thaw, well, it started to, it cooled off. And people like Solzhenitsyn were no longer protected. And the KGB was after him. They tried to assassinate him once with ricin, what they believe now is to have been ricin. And they raided his offices. They constantly harassed him and abused him. They were trying to get him. And what they wanted him to do was to leave. They wanted him to leave the Soviet Union. But he didn't want to. He wanted to stay because he was a Russian nationalist. And he believed in staying. And he believed in fighting. And he spoke truth to power when it really mattered. See, he knew that if he broke any law, he'd be shipped to the Gulag again, and he'd probably die in the Gulag, right? Because the Gulag existed up until 1991. Never forget that. Even during Gorbachev, it existed, okay? Now, Solzhenitsyn continued to speak truth to power, even though he was very careful to never do anything that would give them an excuse to send him to a prison camp, right? And the KGB knew that he was writing the Gulag Archipelago. They'd heard rumors. They had some informants planted among his set. They also tried to discredit him, actively discredit him. Yuri Andropov was behind that effort to discredit him. Like, for instance, a lot of people say that Solzhenitsyn is anti-Semitic, and that calumny, that libel, is from Yuri Andropov, who deliberately tried to get Solzhenitsyn pegged as an anti-Semite to discredit him. And that lasted for decades, you know. But anyway, they tried to discredit him, they tried to do all sorts of things. And finally, in 1970, Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize for Literature, because on the strength of Ivan Denisovich and The First Circle and the pages of August 1914, the West, nobody really knew about the Gulag Archipelago. But finally, in 1973, the KGB happened to catch a woman, I forget her name, who had a chunk of the Gulag Archipelago, and they kept her awake for like 3-4 days and finally broke her, and she confessed to what the book was really about. And she, poor thing, committed suicide because she felt so guilty because of this betrayal. But because of this betrayal, Solzhenitsyn realized that he had to put out the Gulag Archipelago finally. So he smuggled it out, and it was published by the YMCA Press in Paris. And it was, the Soviet Union lost all of its moral authority after that. Nobody could seriously look at communism as anything other than a system of evil. And that's what Solzhenitsyn did. It was single-handedly. He spoke truth to power. And he changed the world's opinion about the Soviet Union in a way that was irrevocable. And a lot of people think that the intellectual death of the Soviet Union happened when the Gulag Archipelago was released. So eventually, Solzhenitsyn was kicked out of the Soviet Union, I believe in '74, and he was kicked out. He was flown to West Germany, and then from West Germany he traveled on to Stanford, where he stayed for a bit, and eventually settled in Cavendish, Vermont, where he stayed for 20 years, until finally the Soviet Union collapsed and he returned. During this time, he worked on a cycle of novels called The Red Wheel, and these novels are all, on the one hand, they are extraordinary achievements, but on the other, they never shake that anxiety of influence of Tolstoy that I said. But it doesn't matter, because Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is the book. And that book is enough. There are 30 volumes of Solzhenitsyn's collected works, but all you need is really Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago. Now, the thing is, see, Solzhenitsyn was a Moses-like figure. He had seen the face of God, and he came back down to earth, just like Moses. And he told people what's what. He was a moralist. He was a man who was not afraid of anything. He had seen the face of evil. He'd been there in war. I mean, he wrote about the horrors that he saw of the atrocities that the Russian army committed, and then in the concentration camp and the Gulag, he saw it up close, and so he had the moral authority to say this is good and this is evil. You read his books, you read his nonfiction, his commentary, his political ideas, and you realize that he was extremely moderate. He believed in nationalism, he believed in local self-rule, self-government. He was very impressed by the New England style town meetings and how localities would look after themselves and make decisions for their own on their own issues, as opposed to waiting for some big power from a faraway central authority to dictate what had to be done. He was a great admirer of that, and he was not an expansionist. He was certainly not an anti-Semite, as he's often pegged by people who want to discredit him. Now, why do people in the West want to discredit him? Very simple. He thought that the West was weak, and he thought that the permissiveness of the West would ultimately lead to its downfall, which is, of course, what the West did not want to hear. They were all happy to hear how the Soviet Union was shit, which it was, but they didn't want to hear, they didn't want to look at the face of a man who was looking at them and judging them. Now, in my own case, insofar as Solzhenitsyn is concerned, as a young man, I studied him. I read Gulag Archipelago. I read Gulag Archipelago when I was like 16 years old, by chance. And it had a profound impact on me. That's why I was never a communist or a left-leaner in any case of the word, because I recognized that, because of this book, that the political left eventually ended in the Gulag. That's the ultimate goal of left-wing politics, of collectivism. That's why, for me, the book is such an important thing. And the thing is, see, when I was young, I was a little bit alienated by the persona of Solzhenitsyn, because he's such a powerful moralist. This man with a big beard, bald but with thick hair on the sides, and he looks at you sternly with judgment in his eyes. He doesn't take any shit from you. And it's hard to look such a man in the eye. And you sort of like don't want him to be looking at you, because his eyes are filled with judgment. But not because of that are they lacking in mercy. All right? And that's the thing about Solzhenitsyn. I mean, he's a humanist. He is a man who understands that human beings are filled with flaws. As I've grown older as a man, I read Solzhenitsyn and I get so much out of him. I get so... he's a hard man. He's a terribly hard man. And yet he is a man... He is a man that I aspire to be someday. Because he was wise, and he was kind, and he was filled with mercy. But with judgment too. Because he recognized, as you begin to recognize as you grow older, that, you see, only the guilty fear judgment. See? Those who have lived a decent life, a good life, they're not afraid of judgment. They're not afraid of that at all. It's those who have lived wrong, those who are guilty, those are the people who recoil from judgment. And that was the secret of Solzhenitsyn. That's why in the West, he was not received with open arms. Somebody like Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who was just a two-faced, toady, yes, because he would pander to his audience. But Solzhenitsyn never pandered to his audience. He was always one line. The line of God. Now, as I've said, I don't really believe in God, but I certainly respect those who do. And I understand and appreciate where they are coming from. Solzhenitsyn was a man of God. And he believed in goodness and evil. And he spoke truth to power in a way that is incomprehensibly brave. Because he was one man. Just one former Zek. One former concentration camp inmate. A nobody, a nothing. And he stood up against the Soviet Union and spoke truth to power. So when you see these little twerps at Evergreen, State College, going on and on about some shit, oh, truth to power, man, you're like, you just shake your head. You look at them with contempt. They don't know suffering. They don't know real struggle. They don't know real bravery. All right? Now, what's the point of me saying all of this about Solzhenitsyn? Well, read Ivan Denisovich, read Gulag Archipelago, yes. But not only read those books, which are very valuable, but look at Solzhenitsyn's life. Read his life. Because he is a great man. And he's a bitter pill to swallow when you're young. But as you grow older, you will see the strength of the man, the courage. And that kind of courage, that kind of strength, just like in his heart, in his soul, to face the things that he most feared and face them with a clear conscience, that is something to aspire to. That is the kind of man that you want to be. Whatsoever your path in life may be. He is a model. He is a Moses for our times. Yes.